Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to do a deep dive into a case that really shook Chile and led to some huge changes in their laws. We're talking about Daniel Zamudio.
Yes.
His death back in 2012 became a symbol of the fight against homophobia. And we're going to explore everything about this case today. The events, the impact, and Daniel's legacy, especially that anti-discrimination law at the Zamudio.
It's so important to remember that behind all the legal stuff, the social change, there's a human story.
Yeah,
To really get this case, we need to start with Daniel Zamudio, the person.
absolutely. It's easy to get lost in the legal details. Forget that at the heart of this is a young man whose life was tragically cut short. So what can you tell us about Daniel's life before the attack?
Well, from what we've got here, we see Daniel was 24 years old, loved music, dreamt of being a father someday. He was working to finish his education and wanted to be a model. Had his whole life ahead of him.
Just heartbreaking to think about everything that was taken from him. And the attack itself was brutal. Can you take us through what happened that night back in March of 2012?
It was March 3rd, 2012, when Daniel was attacked in Sam Borja Park in Santiago, targeted just because he was gay. The four who did it were Alejandro Angulo Tapia, Patricio Ahumada Garay, Raul Alfonso Lopez Fuentes, and Fabian Alexis Mor Amora. They inflicted horrific injuries, used broken bottles, a heavy stone, even carved swastikas into his skin. Chilling. Just a chilling example of the hate behind this.
And one of them, Raul Lopez, even confessed to urinating on Daniel while shouting homophobic slurs.
Yeah.
Just unimaginable cruelty.
What's really disturbing is that Daniel had actually talked to Lopez earlier that night, told him he was afraid of being targeted for being gay.
Oh, wow.
It's just another layer of betrayal on top of this already horrific act.
Makes you wonder, did they plan this attack, or was it like a spur-of-the-moment thing fueled by alcohol and prejudice?
It's hard to say for sure. What we do know is that their actions were driven by homophobia and alcohol, a toxic mix. According to Lopez's confession, it all started after they'd been drinking. Raises questions about alcohol's role in violence, how it lowers inhibitions, especially when there's prejudice already there.
It's sadly not an isolated incident either. This reflects a bigger issue, right? Violence and discrimination against LGBTQ plus people in Chile and, well, all over the world.
Absolutely. This case, as tragic as it is, isn't unique, unfortunately. It shines a light on the systemic problems and prejudice that LGBTQ plus individuals face every day.
Daniel's story connected with so many people because it really showed how vulnerable a community can be when they're marginalized and targeted simply for being who they are.
Exactly. It brought this issue of homophobic violence right to the forefront of the national conversation, forced people to confront the reality of these hate crimes and how devastating they can be.
Let's talk about the perpetrators themselves. Understanding their backgrounds might help us understand the circumstances that led to this tragedy.
Of the four, only Fabian Mora didn't have a criminal record. The others, particularly Patricio Ahumada, had long histories of violence.
Ahumada, nicknamed Patacor, was actually out on parole when this happened. He had a long rap sheet. Robbery, assault, even threats with a knife.
That's right. And this detail brings up a crucial part of this story. It goes beyond just these four guys. Ahumada was on parole despite his violent past. That raises big questions about the justice system and parole in Chile at that time.
Makes you wonder how someone with that kind of history was deemed safe to be back in society. Were there any warning signs that were missed?
There were reports that said Ahumada was high risk, likely to reoffend, yet they granted him parole, and the consequences were devastating. This exposed some big flaws within the gendarmerie, the institution that manages prisons and parole in Chile.
A stark reminder that individual cases can point to bigger societal issues, things that need to be fixed.
Exactly. This wasn't just about four individuals, it was about a system that failed to protect its citizens.
So we have a group of young men fueled by hate and alcohol, and a system that seemingly missed some critical warning signs. It all came together, this perfect storm, and led to this brutal attack on Daniel Zamudio. Just incredibly tragic.
Yes. And what followed was 24 days of Daniel clinging to life in the hospital, fighting to survive. His family, the whole nation were watching, praying for him to recover.
Those 24 days, wow. Agonizing for everyone. I can't imagine that emotional roller coaster.
Filled with hope and despair, conflicting medical reports coming out, and sadly, despite everyone's best efforts, the damage was just too severe.
And then on March 27, 2012, Daniel lost his fight, left a nation in mourning and demanding justice.
His death sent shockwaves through Chile. It sparked a movement for change, a movement that would last for years. Daniel's death, it wasn't just a tragedy, it was the catalyst. sparked a national conversation about discrimination, about hate crimes, and it really forced Chile to re-examine its laws, its attitudes.
Yeah, it really felt like a turning point, didn't it? Like, it went beyond just seeking justice for Daniel. It was about making sure this didn't happen to anyone else. So what happened next? Did all this outcry actually lead to action?
It did. All the public outrage, the efforts of Daniel's family, human rights groups, they put immense pressure on the government.
Right.
And that pressure led to something huge. Ley Zamudio.
Chile's landmark anti-discrimination law. That's incredible to go from something so awful to, like, creating a law to prevent it from happening again. Pretty remarkable. Can you tell us more about Ley Zamudio? What does it actually do?
Okay, so Ley Zamudio, officially it's the anti-discrimination law, was a huge step forward for Chile. It basically bans discrimination based on all sorts of things. Sexual orientation, gender identity, race, religion, disability, you name it.
So it wasn't just about protecting LGBTQ plus people. It was about protecting everyone, no matter their background, their beliefs.
Exactly. It was a major change for Chile. It acknowledged the rights and dignity of all individuals, created a framework for a more inclusive, just society.
Sounds like a really comprehensive law. Was there any pushback against it?
Oh, there were definitely challenges. Some groups weren't happy about it.
Yeah.
You got to remember, before Ley Zamudio, Chile didn't have comprehensive anti-discrimination laws.
Right.
This was new territory, and not everyone was on board.
Makes sense. Such a big shift is going to meet some resistance. Were there any specific groups or individuals who were really vocal against it?
One big source of opposition came from the Catholic Church.
Really?
You'd think, given their stance on, well, on moral issues, that they'd be more forceful about this, right? But their response to Daniel's murder, to the push for this law, was surprisingly quiet. They didn't strongly condemn the crime until after Daniel died, and even then it was brief, didn't have the, I guess, the power that many expected.
That is interesting. Given the church's influence in Chile, did they say why they didn't take a stronger stance?
The most prominent figure to comment was Ricardo Azadi, the Archbishop of Santiago. He said that the church had given private support to Daniel's family, but no details on what that was.
Okay.
And he kind of downplayed the attack, suggested there were other motives behind the public reaction, focused more on his opposition to the bill itself.
So instead of addressing the hate crime, the focus shifted to politics, and opposing the law meant to prevent it.
That's how it was seen by many. The church's response, or lack of response, I guess, was viewed as a missed opportunity, a chance to stand up against hate and violence towards LGBTQ plus people, and they didn't take it. Some even saw their inaction as contributing to the stigma around homosexuality.
A reminder that even powerful institutions can be slow to change, especially when it comes to deeply held social norms and beliefs. Did their opposition have much of an impact on the law being passed?
It definitely created a lot of discussion and debate, but in the end, the public wanted justice, and Daniel's family and other groups, they fought hard. The bill had been stuck in Congress for years, but after Daniel's death, things changed. It was fast-tracked and passed in record time, became law on July 12, 2012.
Less than 4 months after he died. Wow, that's amazing. Turning such a terrible event into a victory. Says a lot about how much Daniel's story affected Chile. But passing a law is one thing, actually changing people's minds is another, right? What kind of impact has Ley Zamudio had since it was implemented?
Ley Zamudio has been a game changer in a lot of ways. It's raised awareness about discrimination, offered protection for vulnerable groups. It's even led to convictions in several big discrimination cases.
That's great.
But, like any law, it's not perfect.
So what are some of the challenges?
Enforcement's a big one. Proving discrimination can be tough, even with a law. And then there are those deep-seated societal attitudes. Laws can create a structure for justice, but changing hearts and minds, well, that takes time and a lot of effort.
Sounds like Ley Zamudio was a huge step in the right direction, but the fight for true equality continues.
Absolutely. It's a powerful tool, but it's not a magic wand. We need constant vigilance, education. Everyone, from individuals to institutions, has to be committed to building a culture of respect and inclusion.
So while Ley Zamudio is a positive change for Chile legally, the real work is changing people's hearts and minds, making sure everyone feels safe, valued, no matter their differences.
You got it. And this actually brings us to another controversial aspect of this case, something that shows just how complex discrimination and social justice can be. Remember that whole thing with the two doctors, the ones who were also politicians, and they made Daniel's medical information public.
Yeah, that was really disturbing what happened there.
Okay, so there were these two doctors, Marco Antonio Nunez and Juan Luis Castro. They were also members of parliament, and they revealed details from Daniel's medical records without his family's consent. They said that Daniel had gotten this Clostridium difficile bacteria in the hospital.
What was their reasoning for that? Were they trying to help or hurt Daniel's case?
They said they were trying to expose problems with hygiene at the hospital. Apparently, other patients had gotten the same bacteria,
Mm-hmm.
but it completely backfired.
How so? It sounds like they were trying to point out a real public health concern. What went wrong?
Their timing was off, and the way they presented the information was a problem. First, they didn't have permission from the family. They violated patient confidentiality. And remember, his family was already dealing with so much. Second, by suggesting this bacteria might have been a factor in Daniel's death, they accidentally gave the defense lawyers something to use.
So their actions, even if they meant well, ended up hurting Daniel's case.
Exactly. The defense lawyers jumped on this, tried to blame the hospital instead of the attackers. This caused Daniel's family even more pain. It muddied the waters around his cause of death, which, let's be clear, was the brutal attack.
Wow, good intentions gone wrong. They were focused on this one problem, but didn't think about the bigger picture, especially the impact on Daniel's family and the trial.
It really highlights how important responsible information sharing is, especially when you're dealing with sensitive medical information in an active legal case. It also shows the responsibility that people in power have, especially in medicine and politics. Their actions should always prioritize the people they serve, not their own agendas.
It's a lesson for everyone, really. We need to think about how our actions might affect others, especially when those actions can have such a big impact. What happened after that? Did those doctors face any consequences?
People were outraged, as you can imagine. They were accused of unethical behavior, opportunism, not caring about Daniel's family. The Ministry of Health even filed a complaint with the medical college. They had a disciplinary hearing for violating their professional ethics.
So there were some real consequences. It seems like their attempt to expose a problem ended up causing more problems.
Yeah, it did. And it reminds us that even good intentions can lead to big mistakes, especially when you're not being ethical and you don't see the whole picture.
We've talked a lot about the societal impact, Zamudio, all the controversies, but we haven't really touched on the actual trial. What happened there?
The trial itself was huge. Everyone in Chile was watching. And the evidence against those four was overwhelming. There was no question they were guilty.
Given how brutal the crime was and how much the public wanted justice, I imagine the prosecution wanted the harshest sentences possible. What were the verdicts?
All four were found guilty of aggravated homicide. That means the hate behind the crime was recognized. Patricio Ahumada, the ringleader, the one with the worst criminal history, got the toughest sentence: life in prison.
Life imprisonment, that sends a message. These acts of hate won't be tolerated. It's some justice for Daniel and his family. What about the others?
Angulo and Lopez, who were both heavily involved, got 15 years each. And Fabian Mora, who played a smaller role and had no prior record, got 7 years.
7 years. That does seem light compared to the others, especially given what happened. Was there any pushback against that?
People definitely debated whether it was enough. Some thought it wasn't a strong enough deterrent. But the judge took into account Mora's level of involvement and his lack of priors.
I get it. When emotions run high, people question things. But the legal system's supposed to look at each case individually, all the details.
Exactly. No sentence can truly make up for a life lost, but the legal process holds people accountable. It tells everyone this is not okay.
It reminds us that justice is complicated. You have tough choices to make, compromises. But the goal is to uphold the law, protect people, and prevent future crimes.
And with Daniel Zamudio, his death showed us the worst of humanity, but it also led to important changes. His story tells us, even when faced with terrible things, the fight for justice and equality has to go on.
So we talked about the convictions, the sentences, but what about after that? Where are these guys now? Any remorse? Any rehabilitation?
Well, it's kind of a mixed bag. Patricio Ahumada, the ringleader, the one with the life sentence, he's still locked up, still considered a high risk. Reports say he's still violent, no real remorse.
A reminder that prison doesn't always change a person, huh? What about the others? The ones with the shorter sentences? Any progress there?
Alejandro Angulo and Raul Lopez, the ones with the 15-year sentences, they've kept pretty quiet in prison. Some reports say they feel remorse, are trying to change. Others say they aren't. Hard to know for sure. It's a long process. And figuring out if someone's truly changing in prison, well, it's complicated.
I bet. Hard to imagine carrying the weight of a crime like that, trying to come to terms with it. What about Fabian Mora? He got out back in 2016, right? Served his 7 years.
Yeah, and a lot of people were watching him closely when he got out. Understandably, there was a lot of anxiety, anger. People felt his sentence was too light.
I can see why, especially for those most affected by this whole thing. Did Moore ever address what he did? Express any remorse?
He did, but it caused even more controversy. A few years after he was released, he did a TV interview. And instead of clearly saying he was sorry, he minimized what he did, contradicted what he said in court, even claimed he only punched Daniel once, said Daniel had groped him.
Wow, that's a pretty shocking claim, especially after all the evidence in the trial. It's like he completely changed his story.
Yeah, it was a controversial interview. A lot of people were outraged, brought up a lot of pain for Daniel's family. They felt betrayed, like he was trying to shift the blame, not take responsibility.
He shows you that just because someone serves their time, it doesn't mean they actually understand what they did or feel true remorse.
And for Daniel's family, it's like the pain never ends. Real closure. In a case like this, it's about acknowledging the harm, taking responsibility, and really trying to change.
Yeah, it's a reminder that justice, as important as it is, doesn't always provide the resolution we might want. The trauma of something like this runs deep. Healing takes time.
The Daniel Zamudio case, with all its complexities and controversies, really forces us to look beyond the headlines, beyond the legal stuff. It makes us confront prejudice and hate in our own communities, makes us think about how we can create a better world.
It's a call to action for all of us. We need to stand up to discrimination whenever we see it. We need to learn about the impact of prejudice and fight for a world where everyone feels safe, respected, valued.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive. The horrifying attack, the impact it had, the changes it brought about in Chilean society. This case reminds us how fragile life is and how destructive hate can be.
Daniel's story is incredibly sad, but it also shows us the power of resilience. The fight for justice never stopped, and positive change happened, even after something so awful. Zamudio, created because of this tragedy, is a testament to his legacy and a symbol of hope. Hopefully someday, senseless violence like this will be a thing of the past.
Daniel's name should remind us to challenge prejudice, to embrace diversity, and to work hard to build a world where everyone can live with dignity, respect, and free from fear, no matter who they are.